So today, first of all, thank you very much for inviting me. Great pleasure to be here. Only took me 15 hours to get here yesterday, but it's worth it. Today I'm going to be talking to you about fake news and the economy of emotions. Problems, causes and solutions. So I'm based in Wales and UK. I'm a professor in journalism and polcoms. You all know fake news has been popularised in journalistic discourse and in academic discourse since Trump really was elected to president in 2016, and also Brexit happened that year as well. So shortly afterwards, I co-wrote a paper which came out in a journal, Digital Journalism, and it was the title of this lecture. So the paper was based on a number of things. Largely, first of all, our analysis of pre-election images published by Breitbart, which I don't need to introduce to you. You obviously have been talking about this quite a bit. And these got a lot of engagement on Facebook, all sorts of pictures. The images got the most engagement. It's stuff that the pro-Trump campaign were promoting about Trump's policies, obviously very simplified and emotive, time to drain the swamp, etc., corrupt establishment. Breitbart Facebook photos on the opposition, on Clinton, you know, that she was under FBI investigation for a bunch of email problems, that she had these links with Putin's Russia. Breitbart Facebook photos on the establishment news media, which of course was not to be trusted because they are scammed, rigged, working for Hillary Clinton. So these are one of the things that inspired my paper. We also talked to a bunch of technologists, journalists, editors, non-profit, PR firms, analytics firms, and other academics, and to get some insight into what was going on, because 2016 we weren't really sure. And then, wonderfully, the British Parliament launched what became known as the Fake News and Disinformation Inquiry. And that attracted a huge amount of written submissions from experts and stakeholders in Britain. It ran for 2 years. It only finished reporting earlier this year. It has 2 reports out there. By the way, these slides are on SlideShare if you want them. You can follow me on Vian Bakir, one on Twitter, and it's all up there. And me and my co-author, we made some submissions to the Fake News Inquiry, and it is based on one of those submissions that our paper came to be. So what I want to do today is just briefly update you on some of the themes in that paper, because much has been published on fake news since then. But my key point is this, and I'm sure you'll understand this well. If you can understand what people are feeling, then you can better target them to push their emotional buttons. And you can do this for real news, you can do this for fake news, you can do this for political campaigning, you can do this for propaganda. And this was the case in 2016 when we looked at this. But as we pointed out in our paper, we also need to be aware of what is coming down the line. And at that point, we saw the real scope for personally and emotionally targeted news produced by algo journalism, produced by AI, married with the fakeness of fake news. And this, of course, is highly damaging. It damages the stock of knowledge believed to be true, and because it's emotive, it also mobilizes people. So how do you solve this problem? It's a democratically problematic situation across the world, and everyone who looks at this in depth seems to agree that we need a multi-stakeholder set of solutions. No one stakeholder in society can solve this on their own. Journalists cannot solve this on their own, although you're obviously a very important part of the mix. So you probably don't really need this slide, but I put it in anyway. What is fake news? I mean, academics have been researching this quite vociferously. We didn't really know what it was specifically, but I think there is some agreement now that it needs to have these 3 things to be called a fake news story. It needs to be low in facticity, it needs to have intention to deceive, and it needs to look like a genuine news story. So, one example would be this story on Facebook, which was doing the rounds when Trump was being elected in 2016, which was Pope Francis shocks the world and endorses Donald Trump for president. Of course, totally false. What does fake news look like? Well, it looks like that Facebook post, but also many other things as well. So Horn and Adal have done some analysis on this, and they find that, generally speaking, fake news is shorter and less informative than genuine news. It uses less complex and more personal language, and it uses longer titles, the headline, which contains the main claim of the article. So they conclude that fake news is very targeted towards audiences who are not likely to read beyond the titles. And because there's no rational argumentation really going on in these fake news stories, they also conclude that the persuasion lies on this thing known as heuristics, shorthands, basically, such as the conformance of the information to the beliefs of the reader. You might then ask, logically, well, is this really a problem? How much news online is actually fake? Is it a huge problem? Well, remember we have quite a tight definition of what fake news is, right? So it's not all disinformation, it's just one subset. But if you take this definition, you actually find, from the few studies that exist, that perhaps not very much news online is actually fake news, but it is enough to be a problem. So I'll just whiz you through a couple of studies that have been done on this by journalists and academics. So you're probably all aware of the BuzzFeed study, which looked at American hyper-partisan fake book sites, and this was shortly before the 2016 US presidential election. They basically reviewed the accuracy and the engagement from 6 large hyper-partisan Facebook pages. They selected 3 from the right and 3 from the left wing. And they found that the hyper-partisan Facebook pages consistently feed their millions of followers fake or misleading information. And it was more prevalent amongst the right wing. So 38% of the posts in the 3 right-wing Facebook hyper-partisan pages were fake. In the left-wing version, it was 19%. And the falsehoods often take the form of claims and accusations against people, against companies, against police, against movements, Black Lives Matter, against Muslims, against liberals, against conservatives, of course designed to bring division and polarization. And the BuzzFeed authors, there were Silverman and others, they conclude that this is really the best way to attract and grow an audience if you're a politician and you want to do this for political content and you want to do it on Facebook. You basically play to the partisan biases, you use false or misleading information, and you simply tell people what they want to hear, preferably using explosive headlines, passages that urge people to click and share in order to show their support or to express their outrage. So this was a relatively small study, all right, although interesting. And the example up there, Obama gives final address to the United Nations, is one of the many articles that they looked at from Freedom Daily. Nasty surprise, Obama told Americans that their freedom is over. Fake. We do have a bigger study looking into how much news online is fake as well. This was a computational analysis of the news media landscape from 2014 to 2016, so 2 years. And it investigates the role of fake news in this online database called the Global Database of Events, Language and Tone. So every day, this database takes in all news-like content from online sources, which includes Google News. It doesn't have a quality control system, so it also contains fake news websites. Now, they found, in that 2-year database, they found 60 fake news websites and 171,000 odd stories from fake news websites in that data set. So is that a lot in the scheme of things? It doesn't sound like an awful lot to me. But what they also found is that the content generated from the fake news sites in that 2-year period was on the rise. They also found that fake news is particularly responsive to the agendas of the partisan media, like Breitbart, across all sorts of issues. So fake news will take its cues from what partisan media are reporting on the economy, on education, on environment, on international relations, religion, taxes, and unemployment. So quite a lot of issues, really. So fake news isn't that prevalent, but it is a bit of a problem, and it's on the rise. So how many people consume fake news, then? Well, again, it's not that many, but it's quite an intense thing that's going on amongst the people who do consume it. So there are a few studies here on how many citizens have visited fake news sites in America and in France and Italy. And these are basically from 2016 and 17. So 3 studies I'll whiz you through here. The first one by Guess et al. This is American, they looked at an American national survey and they combined this with individual web traffic histories. So this was October, November 2016. So again, around about the time Trump was elected. So they find that 1 in 4 Americans visited a fake news website in that period. The fake news production and consumption was overwhelmingly pro-Trump. Trump supporters rather than Clinton supporters are visiting these fake news websites, basically being taken there by Facebook, a key vector here. Also, you might be interested to know, is that the fact-checked, because there were fact checks of the fake news, almost never reached the people who are actually consuming the fake news. So it's not to say fact-checking is pointless, but it's not actually reaching the people who are actually consuming the fake news, according to this study. And the fake news consumption is really heavily concentrated amongst a small group of people. About 60% of the visits to the fake news websites came from just 10% of the people with the most conservative online information diet. So basically, their conclusion is that there is an echo chamber going on here. It's very deep. So that's that study. Another study by Nelson and Tanager was of online visitation data across mobile and desktop platforms. And this again was in the lead up to the 2016 US presidential election. They basically find that fake news, the audience is small and it's very disloyal. And it's also a group of very heavy internet users. So you could just imagine this horde of internet, people obsessed with the internet, being on the internet, small and disloyal. They'll look at anything, basically. And then this interesting study in France and Italy by Fletcher and others, this is from the Reuters group in Oxford, they find, again, that the audience of fake news sites is very limited when you compare it to the audience of established news sites, and you can breathe a sigh of relief, I guess. They looked at 300 websites in each of France and Italy that the independent fact-checkers had identified as publishers of false news, and they basically measured the site's reach, attention, and number of interactions on Facebook. So a much smaller reach on the most popular fake news websites as well. It's less than 1% of the online population are going there. If you compare it to the monthly reach of the popular mainstream news sites like La Figaro in France or La Repubblica in Italy, it's much, much less, 22% and 50% there, 1% on fake news. So again, small audience, but it's concentrated and it's a very deep echo chamber. So then, if it's small, but it's concentrated, does fake news really matter? I think it does matter, and quite significantly. Although exposure to fake news may be low, I think it's very corrosive. We're very bad at detecting deception. The studies show this. Reflect upon your own consumption as well. The presence of fake news in the ecosystem is problematic as well. It alters what we believe to be true and what we trust. Of course, false information spreads very rapidly on social media. And you know that digital news is increasingly emotionalized. You know that fake news is negatively emotive. And studies also show us that emotions are very contagious online. So I will briefly speak to each of these points with some of the quite interesting studies, I think, that demonstrate these things. Firstly, the fact that we are bad at detecting deception. So there's a couple of studies on this. Again, they're American. The most studied nation on Earth for communications, I think. But so again, this is a journalistic study of an online survey, a national survey of American adults, taken again just after Trump was elected. It found that fake news headlines fool American adults about 75% of the time. I think that's quite a shocking statistic, actually. A second study looked at the kids in America. This looked at 7,800 responses from middle school, high school, and university college students about their ability to assess online information sources as to whether or not it's false or fake or true. And it concludes that they're easily duped. This is the Stanford History Education Group study. So we're bad at detecting deception, or at least Americans are bad at detecting deception. Probably not true necessarily in every part of the world, but that's another story. The idea that the presence of fake news in the ecosystem alters what we believe to be true and what we trust, I think, is worrying. Again, a couple of studies here. These are all psychological experiments, so do they cohere in the real world? Well, it's an experiment, so we can't be sure. But what the experiments show us, first of all, the first study, is that repeated exposure to fake news headlines increases their perceived accuracy. This is called the illusory truth effect for fake news headlines. And it will occur even if the fake news headline is very unbelievable overall. It will occur even when the fake news story is labelled as contested by fact checkers. And it will occur even if that fake news story is inconsistent with what the reader's political ideology is. So, you'd think all these things might push it the other way, but no. And that is quite worrying, I think, the illusory truth effect. Repeated exposure to fake news headlines increases their perceived accuracy. Doesn't matter what the fact checkers say or what the people actually even believe. The second study up there shows that, again experimental, shows that exposure to elite discourse on fake news reduces the perceived accuracy of the media in general. It's especially been demonstrated for supporters of President Trump. Apparently it didn't have any effect on respondents who disapprove of Trump. So I'm not sure what that says really. Yes. So anyway, so that's the experiment. Exposure to elite discourse on fake news leads to less trust in media and less accurate identification of real news. And then the third study. A fake news attack by Trump. Trump is always attacking the media for being fake. The failing fake news Times, that sort of stuff. Fake CNN. He's always, every day, talking about this. And again, this reduces perceived media accuracy and media trust amongst those who support him. So again, these are American studies. Would it hold for the rest of the world? I don't know, but I think they're interesting and worrying. The other point then is that it does matter that there is fake news in the ecosystem because false news spreads really rapidly through social media. Again, a couple of studies that show this. The first one looks at fake news consumption patterns in the run-up to, again, the 2016 presidential election. It was such a key moment that, right? Everyone started to study what the hell was going on. And it also looked at, afterwards as well. So they looked at visits to fake news sites. Where do they originate from? And basically they find that social media is to blame. You already know that, probably. But the study confirms it. And then the second study there, I think this is a really interesting one. You have probably come across it because it's been well publicised in the more popular scientific press. But this is a big data study that looks at the differential diffusion of all verified true and false news stories on Twitter and it took a 10-year period, 2006 to 2017. So it studied a lot of tweets, right? It's big data. It was 126,000 stories tweeted by over 3 million people. They find that falsehoods, especially false political news, diffuses on Twitter significantly further, faster, deeper, and more broadly than the truth. That's worrying. They also find that bots accelerate the spread of true and false news at the same rate. Therefore, they conclude, false news is spreading more than the truth, not because of bots, but actually because of humans. It's the humans on Twitter that are more likely to spread false news. I'll come back to that study in a minute, because it plays a part in the next point as well. So digital news, as you know, is increasingly emotionalized. This has been pointed out by academics of journalism for some time. So Bakir and Durz's study back in 2016 posited some reasons for this. They said, look, mobile digital media are increasingly personalized. In other words, there are algorithmically formed filter bubbles. And they form an intimate part of our lives. You know, our handheld smart devices are always on and are always with us, no matter what you're doing. And, you know, your public and personal networks interconnect on these devices. And of course, journalism turns to emotion to virally engage the news consumer in an increasingly economically competitive news ecology. So clickbait headlines. You also see this in studies of narrowcast news channels and political blogs, talk radio, cable news. Again, a US study, quite a famous one, back in 2011. So this is some time ago. Already it was finding extensive outrage discourse. In other words, efforts to provoke a visceral response from the audience, usually in the form of anger, fear, or moral righteousness. And they point out that this thrives in a narrowcast environment where the networks reach out to smaller and more homogeneous audiences. And they can afford to offend the rest because they're not going for the broad audience, they're going for the narrow audience. And, you know, by outrage discourse, they mean stuff like mockery and sarcasm, exaggeration, insults, name-calling, and ideologically extremism, that sort of language. The third study, which is the big data study I talked about a minute ago on Twitter, across the 10 years on Twitter, they found that the false news stories, which spread farther than the truth, they also found that those false news stories inspired fear, disgust, and surprise in the replies on Twitter. So fear, disgust, and surprise. Unlike the true stories, which inspired anticipation, sadness, joy, and trust in the replies. But the false ones are generating comments of fear, disgust, and surprise, arguably key components of outrage. So fake news, it supercharges the emotional nature of digital news with the outrage. And fake news also is very contagious. This really shouldn't surprise us because studies of social media repeatedly find that emotions are contagious. The most famous and perhaps maybe the most authoritative study on this was done actually with Facebook back in 2014, and this was done in secret, by the way, so I'm not sure about the ethical clearance that this would have got. This study secretly optimized the news feeds on Facebook of almost 700,000 people. They wanted to see how the emotions expressed by others on Facebook influence our own emotions. They basically found that emotions are massively contagious on Facebook. If you just tweak that news feed to be a bit more positive or a bit more negative, everyone else in that network becomes a bit more positive or a bit more negative as well. In the words of the authors of that study, they found evidence for massive scale contagion via social networks. So Facebook knows this. It's their own study, really, with academics. But it's found in other studies as well, of Twitter, for instance. So an early study of 165,000 tweets during the German elections in 2011, finds that emotionally charged tweets tend to be retweeted more often and more quickly compared to the neutral ones, and that heavy Twitter users tend to post more emotionally charged tweets. And then a third study, this is of English Twitter posts, bigger sample, back in 2010. Again, it finds that popular events are normally associated with increases in negative tweets. So emotions are contagious online. We keep finding that in the studies. And then here's the other thing. Not only are emotions contagious online, but they're highly targeted as well. Highly targeted. Citizens are exposed to fake news, to false news information through behaviourally targeted adverts and posts. In other words, targeting is emotionally loaded. And this might be for commercial gain, it might be for propagandistic gain. We need to remember that Facebook, which is frequently the vector of fake news, spreading Facebook, and I mustn't call it fake book because I frequently do lapse into that. It is an AI machine, an artificial intelligence machine, as indeed are all social media platforms and digital intermediaries. They are honed to use data about their users to deliver targeted advertising. And they have huge reach. Over 2 billion people use Facebook. People are checking their phones about 150 times a day in the developed world, or at least the millennials are. Not sure if I'm in that category. All of this generates huge amounts of data that allows these AI machines to better predict what you will be vulnerable to and what can influence you. So says Tristan Harris, who's the co-founder of the executive director of the Centre for Humane Technology, and this is his oral testimony to the fake news inquiry in Britain that I mentioned at the start. He says, you really do have to see these platforms as AI systems. And the fuel for AI is information that allows you to do better prediction, knowing how to predict what you'll be vulnerable to, what messages you'll be influenced by, what you're not vulnerable to, and what advertisers might want to target you with. And I'm sure you're all aware, but let me remind you anyway, of just how granular that targeting is these days. So Facebook's targeting of people goes through several steps. Step 1, I can't remember what it is. Step 2 filters you by these things on the screen, your location, your connections, interests, behaviours, and demographics. So that's pretty targeted, right? But then when you get to step 3, you get a whole load of more filters which can be used to target you with content, your relationship, what industry you work in, what you do for fitness and wellness, your hobbies, activities, your sport, what technologies you're using, what food and drink are you consuming, are you a parent? If so, how many children? Have you experienced a life event, a new job, for instance, a death? What's your education level? Do you travel? If so, where to? What's your digital activity? Oh, and by the way, what is your gender, age, ethnicity, and politics? We must also remember that Facebook allows uploads of voter profiles to enable even more increased targeting at election times. This is their custom audiences. And all of this is used to serve content, all sorts of content, but often emotive and deceptive messages, fake news, political propaganda, hate speech. And not just to target you if you're susceptible to that content with those messages, but also to deliver them at just the right time, when you're most susceptible, when you're most ready to be engaged. Because they know, they can see it on the graphs. And they know what to push and when to push their audiences emotional buttons to nudge them into certain behaviours. Buying, maybe not so problematic, but voting, more problematic. Voter suppression, even more problematic. Social unrest, absolutely unacceptable, I would say. But this is how it is being used. And the advertising model is basically what is making this happen so that our emotions are targeted for commercial and propagandistic gain. It's not just the social media platforms that are doing this, of course, although they're the major vector, but there's also a whole ecology, which I haven't got time to talk about today, of data analytics and consultancy firms, which are part of this mix as well, and also doing all this sort of stuff with your data. And, 2016 presidential election campaign was just a logical conclusion of this business model and political campaigning intent. It meant that citizens were exposed to fake news and false information through behaviourally targeted adverts and posts. Again, the journalists were great at exposing this. The journalists at BuzzFeed drew our attention to this, really, and then a load of others got on analysis bandwagon as well, thank goodness. And they basically found all sorts of interesting things. This story has been told many times, I think, but worth just pointing it out again. That in 2016, with US President Trump, ordinary people were making money from these fake news websites. The names were often chosen to resemble legitimate news organizations in America. Many computer scientist students and teenagers in Macedonia, a distant country to America, apparently, were doing this. They were launching websites with names like usdailypolitics.com, worldpoliticus.com, donaldtrumpnews.co. These fake news stories basically generated large and engaged audiences. It earned the students in Macedonia thousands of euros daily through digital advertising. Again, the fake news just acts as clickbait. Income is produced by attracting attention to the fake news website and serving behaviourally targeted adverts, tracking the users as they browse pages, serving them adverts on the basis of their online behaviour, what they look at online. The fake news publisher is paid by an ad network, and revenue also comes through click-throughs of the advert itself. My point is this: these students in Macedonia were creating fake news stories for money rather than for propaganda. They did experiment with left-leaning content. At the time, they found it didn't work as well. It was a right-leaning content that performed well, that earned them the money, so that's what they went with. Interesting, I think. But of course, it's not just people making money out of this. Propagandists are also trying to do it as well. We know that Facebook favours emotional content, whether or not it's true. You will be aware of Brexit, I imagine. It greatly pains me as a British person that this is happening. So I'm fairly obsessed with the whole Brexit campaign and what's happened since. Leave.eu was one of the unofficial campaigns during the 2016 referendum in Britain on whether or not to leave the European Union. And Leave.eu campaigned heavily to obviously leave. They basically said their main message was, look, we need to control immigration. It's funded by this guy up there, Aaron Banks, who owns a bunch of insurance companies and diamond mines in South Africa. He also appeared before Britain's fake news inquiry at Parliament, there he is, and he highlighted the methods with which Leave.eu campaigned, his social media methods. I quote from him, "My experience of social media is it is a firestorm, that just like a brush fire, it blows over the thing. Our skill was creating bushfires, and then putting a big fan and making the fan blow." And then he later says in his testimony, for them, immigration set the wildfires burning. And indeed they did. They campaigned very heavily, very falsely, on very sensationalistic and false threats of immigration. The whole of Turkey was going to arrive in Britain, basically, should Brexit not happen, along with all the terrorists. An interesting investigation by Channel 4 News, which is one of Britain's broadcasters, earlier this year, actually found that Leave.eu is behind a fake video that went viral back in the day. And this got hundreds of thousands of views on Facebook. Basically, the video that Leave.eu published, they said they promoted it as an undercover investigation, so it looks like a news story, on Facebook. It claimed to show how easy it is to smuggle migrants into the UK from across the English Channel. But Channel 4 News totally debunked this video several years later by actually looking at satellite data. They found that the satellite data proved that the footage used in the Leave.eu video had been filmed in reverse. And actually, what Leave.eu were showing of migrants entering the UK, it was actually the other way around. The boats were actually leaving the UK with these people on it. So anyway, interesting. So I think the horizon line then, what does this all mean and where are we going with all of this? Unfortunately, I'm not very optimistic. I think it's quite a bleak picture, simply because, 3 years ago, the state of voter profiling and targeting online and deception and affect gave us the Trump presidency and it gave us Brexit. And this was 3 years ago, since which technologies for creating deception and affect and targeting continue to develop. In the paper that I wrote a few years ago, we envisaged that we may well soon see automated fake news creation using artificial intelligence. And yes, that is exactly what has happened. Not to say I can see the future, but you can put trends together. And you'll have talked about this yesterday, I think, the deep fakes, where real people with their faces swapped on video and audio using AI. This is now possible. So, okay, this has always been possible to some extent with CGI editors, computer-generated imagery. This has been possible for about 10 years, but the trends show that this is being now easier and deeper and cheaper to do. The image quality is improving rapidly. It's moving to mobile phones, which improves the accessibility. Barriers to entry are falling for deepfakes. It doesn't require as much training data. Apparently, you can buy deepfakes online. For many threat models, the deepfake doesn't have to even look very real to be effective. We're seeing commercialization of all of this with Adobe. And we're just not ready for this, I don't think. Our cognitive understanding of video, seeing is believing still, I think, for people. We're not ready yet to disbelieve video. I think there's also scope for automated fake news and the manipulation of fellow feeling as well. This is through algo journalism. We know that AI is already used in algo journalism to write simple stories, the headlines and the body copy, for data-heavy stories like financial reports and sports. We already know that fake news creators have financial and propagandistic interest in feeling into online conversations and creating headlines that will resonate with groups. The Macedonian teenagers did this with pro-Trump supporters. Marry this with technology that can detect online emotion with sentiment analysis, and you can start to see how moods can be manipulated and targeted, and how people can be targeted with this sort of material. AI tools allow Google and Facebook to understand the psychographics and the moods of their users. It's what Cambridge Analytica claimed as well, by the way. I think the fake news creation that we saw in 2016 might start to look very tame, actually, in terms of what might be down the line. And it's problematic, right? We know this already. We already know this. So in my final slide, what should we do about it? Well, unfortunately, I think it's a very hard problem to fix because the disinformation media ecology has many stakeholders, and they all need to pull together in the same direction. And they all have solutions, like we talked just before me about education, increasing media literacy. Great. But what about increasing emotional literacy as well? And my talk later today will show all the problems with this, by the way. And that's just one part of the problem. The journalists could fact check till kingdom comes, but it's not going to reach the fact check people who need to see the fact checks, the people who consume fake news. And all of these other people are important as well. The digital intermediaries, the advertisers, the professional persuaders, and the intelligence agencies as well. They all need to pull together in the same direction. I won't go into the solutions because we're sort of out of time, but all the solutions have problems. Let's leave it at that. Otherwise, we wouldn't be in the problem we are today. And if you want to know more, many, many references. Thank you very much for your attention.